Hello, and welcome to the Chain Mountain Podcast. I'm your host, Hank Ackerman. In this episode, we sit down with Chris Jackson, the Vice President of Global Supply Chain at Watlow. Watlow is a global industrial technology company that designs and manufactures advanced thermal systems, including heaters, sensors, and temperature controllers for mission-critical applications in industries like semiconductor, energy, and medical devices. In this episode, Chris and I discuss the growth of industrial sectors, the impact of geopolitical influences, and the role of AI in supply chain management. We also touch on the democratization of technology and its future implications for supply chains, as well as the predictions for the future of technology and leadership. It's a great discussion and hope you enjoy. Chris, welcome to the podcast. Super happy to have you on today and really looking forward to the discussion. So I always start out my podcast with a statistic, right? As I was kind of researching, your background and some of the companies you've worked for, at Watlow, which is kind of a global, call it conglomerate. They participate in a number of different industries, right? And I was looking up the stats on those, and for kind of boring industries, the growth statistic was they have a 5.7 to 10.1 CAGR over the next 5 years, right? And I think that's a pretty strong growth for a market that really is supported by industrials. What do you see is the driver for that growth, right? And if you kind of pick between those different industries, there's obviously some optimism in those industries. What do you see as the drivers?
Yeah, so first off, good morning, Hank, for having me on the podcast. Excited to be here and share with you my insights about, Watlow and supply chains and things like that. So when you look at Watlow, just as an introduction, our company is the world's leading provider of heating solutions. And when we say heating solutions, those are typically done in critical applications. So anything from food and beverage to energy conversion to producing silicon wafers, we provide the thermal feedback loop, as we call it, which is the heaters, the controllers, and we're able to do that to get the right outcome. And so when you look at what's driving our entire industry's growth, it's a couple of things. The first thing is a lot of countries are repatriating. And so we hear about it as, in the United States that, we're bringing back the manufacturing jobs, and that is true. But not only are we doing this, other countries are doing this as well. And so that's
Right.
providing tremendous growth for us. In addition to a lot of our solutions are applied in decarbonization. So a lot of countries are putting money behind getting away from fossil fuels into electrification. And so we're able to provide heating solutions in those applications, in addition to semiconductor wafers. And you read the newspapers as much as I do. Every day you hear about NVIDIA and AI and all the servers that are needed. And so we
Right.
supply a lot of those industries. So those are the things that are helping grow our business and grow the industries that we serve.
That's great. That's great. So give the listeners a little bit of the of that operations footprint, right? So global industry, right?
hmm
You obviously spend a lot of time, sitting on a plane, traveling around. What are you observing that I think a lot of folks who kind of live in America, we're kind of in a little bit of a bubble, right? Sometimes. What are you observing kind of about it? Your point about repatriation is really super interesting, right? It's kind of like who else is doing this? What have you observed about, industry in these other countries and their infrastructure, their investments, those types of things?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's not one particular thing, but it's a combination of several things. So when I think about it from a geopolitical standpoint, I think candidly America has lost some of its shine across the world. I hear things from people that say, "Wow, your politics are much more different." And in fact, I was listening to a podcast this past weekend, and a lot of our allies are even thinking America used to be very predictable. Now it's a bit more unpredictable. And so
Right.
that is why I think you're seeing other powers form across the world, whether that's, a couple of weeks ago you saw Russia and China and North Korea together. You're seeing the Europeans come together. I don't have a particular opinion on either one, if it's good or bad. I just think it is, the changes that we're seeing. So that's part of it as a geopolitical backdrop. What I've seen across most industries right now is just the need to reduce waste and to reduce lead time to market. I
Mhm.
think it's kind of interesting when I look back at the dot-com bubble, and a lot of analogies are being made right now between dot-coms and the AI bubble. And is there going to be an
Right.
AI bubble, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
One of the things I think about is, think about 25 years ago when you ordered something off Amazon. It was so novel, and if you got it
Right.
like in a
Yeah.
couple days,
Yeah.
that was great. Now, if you order something on Amazon, you can literally get an alert every 2 or 3 minutes as to where the
Yeah.
package is and is the package coming close to your place or not. And so the expectations have changed. And so when I think about what does that do to a supply chain and to industries,
Right.
industries have to get much faster. Industries have to get towards more customization, taking out the waste, the lead time, and also the R&D time. That's what I'm hearing from a lot of our customers is, faster, faster, faster. So that's what I'm seeing
Right.
across industries, whether it be I'm in an industrial industry now, or I've been in the toy industry, I've been in the tool industry, I've been in the
Yeah.
writing instruments industry, but talking with, friends I still have in those industries, everybody's seeing the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Man, there's a lot to unpack in in that statement you you just made. But let's start with the last point about what I call the Amazon effect, right? And
Hmm.
how we've now become conditioned to being able to say, I have I place an order and I'm going to see it maybe the next day, maybe I, my dogs often wake us up at 4 o'clock in the morning when the Amazon driver pulls into our driveway and drops off a package, right? And
Right,
and
right.
now we're even getting used to that, right? Sometimes it's for something that we ordered the previous day. So I agree with you. I have a lot of clients. We work on the order to ship, part of their process, right? And as we've become so conditioned to being able to say, I can press a button and it's going to tell me, is the inventory there? When are you going to get it? All that information, right? And most B2B industries, right, still struggle with the ability to be able to tell you, accurately, when exactly can you expect your product. And some of them are lucky just to be able to say, when do you think it's going to leave my facility, let alone get to you, customer, right? So I think it's a great observation. But on the flip side, I think it's interesting because when I look around the world and I look at supply chains around the world, I still think the U.S. is leading in a lot of those areas, and you're seeing these innovations and these concepts from the U.S. that are being adopted now globally. And so I imagine through work like yourself, right, where you go overseas and begin to kind of set these different expectations for those global supply chains, right?
Yeah, it's interesting because I do think a lot of innovation comes from the United States. I also think there's a lot of innovation happening in China.
Mm.
There's a lot of innovation happening in Europe as well.
Hmm.
I think each of those regions of the world bring a different perspective and how to get to the innovation.
Right. That's a great
So,
point.
for me, it's about how do you combine all of those perspectives. In my first global role I ever had, um, it was in a company, and that company, was led from North America, and I was building a center of excellence for supply chain in Slovakia. And
Yeah.
so I remember when we first joined, we were telling the team what to do, and sitting over there with them for weeks at a time, I'm like, no, this doesn't work. This doesn't make sense. They do it differently here. Like they can do this much quicker than what we're asking them to do, and things like that. And so I finally came up with a phrase with the team. I said, I want you to be a net exporter of ideas. I'm like, rather than be a net importer, you need to export your ideas and you
Yeah.
need to go through and tell us why this does and doesn't work and challenge us back as to what we could do quicker, what we could do more efficiently, and how to get closer to our customers. And so when I said that and empowered the team to do that, a lot of things changed. So I kind of always look at this net importer, next net exporter concept
Right.
when I'm talking about ideas or how we're doing the work, and just trying to make sure that those are pretty even across the teams.
Yeah, that's a great point, right? I think there was a term that was coined, a few years back, reverse innovation, right? Where,
Hmm.
you like you pointed out, I think we put like MRI machines went over to China and began to expand, and then they made changes because they realized, hey, this has got to be a lot cheaper. We need, we need 80% of the results at 30% of the cost, right? And
Right.
and those innovations, ultimately come back and improve the technology, even in the U.S. I want to go back to also another point you made, kind of about the global influence and some of the alliances, right? My wife is from Africa, and we recently went back there, and this
Hmm.
is not a new trend, but in Zimbabwe in particular, right? China is the primary uh, so Zimbabwe exports more to China than it does anywhere else, right? Mostly just
Right.
minerals, right? And that's a common theme now across Africa,
Hmm.
and becoming more common certainly across Central America as well, right? And this kind of gets back to American manufacturing, the strength of American manufacturing. We're still the second strongest manufacturer, but in order to feed that manufacturing, right, raw materials are incredibly important. And without the correct diplomacy, diplomatic footprint, and relationships, and the way that we influence, a lot of those countries, are we going to have access to the natural resources to effectively continue to feed American manufacturing, right? So I see this desire for American manufacturing, but I see this incongruency in terms of our diplomatic efforts and our ability to be able to create relationships with countries that are critical to our raw material supply, right?
Yeah, Hank, I agree with your observations. And I do agree, America can be competitive in manufacturing, but the question is, manufacturing what? And why I say the what I mean by that is there's certain industries we're not going to get back, right? We just cannot be cost competitive in those industries. But there are industries where we can be very cost and technology competitive.
Mm-hmm.
So what I do think it's going to be is a combination of taking technology, um, and our manufacturing capability. And that's where, if we can find those industries and those products, that's where we'll be the most competitive. To me, technology is almost like akin to the Cold War a bit. And that really is technology war right now. And you can read many books on this.
Yeah.
Chip Wars was a book that came out several years ago that talked about this,
Mm-hmm.
and so I think where America needs to invest its time, and I'm optimistic we will, is how do we invest in those technologies? And I think that's some of the innovation we bring to the marketplace and our ability to move forward. If I look at what you're talking about, mineral rights, it's kind of interesting to me when I think about supply chains in general. Before COVID and toilet paper outages, people really didn't understand what a supply chain was, and since then, everybody's become more supply chain experts. Now we have the tariff issue, right?
Yeah.
And um, I know a lot of people in trade and customs compliance, and they're like, okay, this is our moment to shine, and
Yeah.
this is where everybody now knows what a trade tariff is. And then to your point about mineral rights, I have colleagues that work in that industry, and yeah, they're just like, yeah, no one ever thought about us. So
Yeah.
I think the supply chain's getting, deeper and deeper in terms of how people are understanding it. And you're correct in my comment earlier about, our partners see us less stable as they did in the past. I agree with you. That's a concern I have because we do have to negotiate for those mineral rights. We do have to think about how do we get those raw materials into our country. So those are all valid concerns you raise.
Right. So you put me onto a really interesting book, the AI Driven Leader by Jeff Woods, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I found there's kind of two interesting takeaways that I found, but I wanted to get your take, on these. First of all, 100% of the leaders when he wrote the book, right, believed that AI was the future. Yet fewer than 5% had taken any meaningful action towards AI implementation, right? So number one, why do you think that is? And I'm going to give you a part B to it, right? Um, it Woods emphasized that most people use AI for 80% of their tasks, right? Routine work that kind of only produces 20% of the business results. Instead, his belief is that leadership level thinking should focus on the critical 20% of the work that delivers 80% of the results. And I think it's a really interesting concept, and it kind of made me sit around and think like, well, what am I using it for?
Sure.
And are there applications out there where we see companies actually able to execute that? And I don't know, maybe you have something, in your real life where you've seen that be the case, right?
Yeah. So thanks for bringing it up, and I'm glad that you enjoyed the book. So you
Yeah.
talk about the 100% of managers saw the importance, but less than 5% did anything about it. Look, I was one of those 95% up to 6 months ago. And when I look back at my own journey and then I talk with other people, I think there's a couple things that really, in my mind, prohibit people from getting quote unquote into AI. The first is terminology. So I remember a couple years ago when AI was really breaking and cutting edge. I mean, it still is now, but like the early part of this, everybody talked about prompt engineering,
Right.
and
Right.
you had to be a prompt engineer, and prompt engineering was going to be the biggest, career out there, and your kid in college better go to
Yeah.
prompt engineering
Yeah.
school, and yada yada yada.
Yeah.
Um, I think that's true and false to a degree. And here's what I mean by that. I think for, getting into the coding and being able to do a lot of complex things in AI, yes, you need some prompt engineering skills. But to be able to interface with a Claude, a Gemini, a ChatGPT, any of these tools, it's really what I learned in the book is it's how you lay out your conversation.
Right. Right.
And Jeff Woods in the book talks about what he calls is the crit method, is that he
Yeah.
talks
Yeah.
about giving it the context, what role you want AI to play, the interviews that you want to have with AI, and then the tasks you want to perform. And so when I think about it at its core, you can say, yes, that's prompt engineering, okay,
Yeah.
but just the term prompt engineering, I think, is a barrier to many people. And look, I'm an engineer, and I found it as a barrier. Um, I think that's part of it. I think the other part of it that's a barrier is, people are scared about it. Jeff Woods points out something in the book that I found fascinating, and I may have the statistic wrong, but as I recall it, um, basically, if you look at the jobs in 1940s, less than 50% of those jobs are still a job today. And so a lot of people, I think, are afraid of it, taking away their jobs. And Jeff Woods talks about, how do you use it to augment what you're doing today? And,
Right.
you give some practical advice. I mean, one of the first ways I started to use AI, I'm a meal prepper. And I said to AI, okay, I'm making 10 meals this week. This is what I want the meals to be. And here's my budget. Come up with a list of ingredients, recipes, and help optimize that. And so getting to that level of detail
Right. Right.
That's bigger than a Google search.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
you mentioned something also about the 80/20, and that was a big revelation for me as well in the book.
Right.
And you're right. When I talk with most people at work or in other industries, they're like, "Yeah, I'm doing this." They're doing Google searches.
Yeah.
And it really struck me about, applying less effort and saying, hey, I can apply 20% of the effort and get 80% of the result.
Right.
Um, we always say Pareto's law is 80/20. I often thought after that kind of hit me, should we say it's 20/80, and that you're
Right.
applying less to get more? And so I thought that was a big takeaway as well. I was actually on a webinar just earlier this week, and they were talking about, mid-market companies can really compete on speed and agility, but AI could definitely be an accelerator to them. I would say the last thing that I think is a hindrance to leaders, there's too many people selling it right now. And
Hmm.
so, I get 5 AI calls a day. Hey, I can optimize your supply chain and do this. Hey, I can do that. And I think
Yeah.
most of these use cases are very textbook. I don't think we've really tapped into the true use of AI. Again, so kind of
Right.
going back to earlier in this conversation, we talked about the AI bubble. I do believe we're in some sort of a bubble. I don't know when it's going to end. If I knew that, I wouldn't be doing my job every day. I'd be
Right.
playing the
Right.
markets.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I do think what will come out of it, 10 years from now, is we'll have a different way of working and using technology and blending those technologies into our processes and also our management of talent and teams. I think that's something that we don't talk about enough.
Hmm.
Um, and so how do we manage our talent and teams in that AI era so that we give more empowerment and more skills to everybody on the team? I think that's going to be a key differentiator for companies in the future.
Right. Right. And how you kind of, especially with agents, right? How you, view AI as, almost an employee, right? If you're a manager,
Yeah.
right? I've got
Yeah.
employees, and I have AI, right? And there's boundaries and parameters that I need to ensure are, kind of kept and respected, as I'm letting it loose on my customers and clients and suppliers, right? Um,
I would say in general, what I'm seeing across most customers is when you think about AI, you're thinking about how do you take that information and then have parameters to make decisions based upon that information. So this is where, on the AI side, now we're getting away from the thought leadership conversation.
mhm.
We're getting more towards the application and systems. And you know, this is where, you hear a lot of the concerns, coming from people about, AI could get evil and all of this stuff, and they're, valid concerns. But
Yeah.
I mean, they're valid concerns because people have the concerns. I'm not quite
Yeah.
sure if that's going to happen or not. I don't know enough about it to say, but it is a concern, and
Yeah.
people are scared of it, right? And so they're scared of what they don't know. So, I just think you know, that technology will evolve over time. I'm not, a lot of companies are chasing those sort of technologies.
Right.
Um, and so I
It,
think for us, it's really about, connecting better to our customers' processes and, how do we integrate better within those processes, I think will be key.
Here, I think there's a lot of interesting innovations in my mind that come from industry that take a long time to trickle down to our day-to-day lives, right? I just think about energy efficiency and how important that is in industry, and yet I'm still flipping light switches around my house, right? So how long is it going to take, to the point where my home understands when I'm walking around the house, how to, when to turn on the heat, when to turn off the heat, all of those much more, kind of important energy considerations if I really wanted to squeeze it out. But I feel like, we live in a pretty, relatively speaking, wasteful world. So, just maybe some thoughts about kind of how you see that innovation trickling down, in our day-to-day lives. And maybe that's probably part of how AI will get applied as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of think about it. Everything that you're talking about is more or less a democratization of technology. It's interesting. I'm on a couple different Facebook groups, and growing up, I was really into computers and stuff like this, and some of these are like vintage Radio Shack ads, and it'll show, in 1986,
Yeah, yeah,
a Tandy home PC was like, $5,000. And you sit
yeah,
and you
yeah.
look at that, and you're like, OMG. Like, that's like 15 grand today.
Yeah,
Like, it's insane. So you think about the technology we have today, when you talk about your home and switches and things
right.
like that. I think over time, those technology changes will evolve in, and that's where I see some of the positive uses of AI and technology curves and that democratization. To me, it's about how do we live with the technology and integrate the technology into our lives, and I think of things with just how we look at things today. Like, everybody has a smartphone, right? And those smartphones
Right,
have
right.
apps. But if you think about it, in the future, how many of those apps are going to be valid? Because a lot of what those apps do is you input information and you get something out, right?
Right, right.
You're asking it something, or you're doing something and you're getting something out. And so as technology evolves, and the technology and the hardware, I think, is what is key, comes together. When those two things come together, then you're going to see, I predict, apps, I won't go so far as to say will go away, but I think over the next, 10 years, apps will be not anything we understand it to be today.
That's really interesting.
So,
Where do so let's get back to supply chain a little bit. This is
mhm.
kind of about supply chain. Where do you see AI getting, most traction in supply chain?
So right now, I think, to me, AI and supply chain is probably more on the doing. So it goes back to Jeff
Hmm.
Wood's book about saying, hey, we're doing 80% of the work with AI. I do see a
Right.
need for that, and that is helping us. I think, from what I'm doing with AI and the team today, if I look at, our demand forecasts, trying to apply some intelligence there,
Right.
I think that that's where I see a lot of momentum. And again, unfortunately, that's where I think a lot of supply chain leaders like myself are really kind of getting tired of getting all the phone calls, right? Because everybody's trying to sell you the same thing, and
Yeah.
they're trying
Yeah.
to make a buck off it really quick. So I
Yeah.
think,
Yeah.
that's where we're challenged. But I see more and more in the data management. I see more
Right.
in the customer experience. I see more in logistics. Um,
Yeah.
some companies out there are doing some pretty neat things
Yeah.
out there. It's interesting. I was talking with one potential supplier to us, and now, they're using agentic robots to basically call carriers to get information, and some of the carriers are also using their robots. So
Right.
it's you
Yeah.
have these bots talking
Bot to
to each
bot.
other.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Absolutely.
not even
Yeah.
humans, right? And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
I think I think those are the early innings of it. I think a lot
Yeah.
of where the innovation is going to come from is how do we take a customer signal. And when I say signal, it's not about how many widgets, it's about what they want that widget to be. Um, what's the functionality that they're looking for and things like that. And how do you customize that all the way through
Right.
your supply chain? And how is your supply chain automated from the factory, from getting the raw materials, and how do you turn that product around quickly? I think that's going to be really the cutting edge stuff. I think, that's inning numbers 5 and 6. And like I said,
Yeah.
we're in inning number 1 right now.
I agree with all your point. You made a couple interesting observations, which I 100% agree with. Demand planning, number one.
Hmm.
That's always an area where supply chain struggled, right? Just getting that front end, and getting, frankly, sales and the key people who are out there with the feelers, right, to be able to put that data in, right? And the reality is that the ADD fantastic salesperson is diametrically juxtaposed to putting stuff into Salesforce and doing a great sales forecast, right? So, fundamentally, you've got an incongruency there. And so how AI is able to, improve that process is incredible. I'm interested. Have you guys done any, work on the data side of, creating efficiencies around maintaining data?
Yeah, look, I've been in supply chains for over 20 years and I've never had data okay. So I
Same
remember when I
experience.
was
Yeah.
when
Yeah.
I was a stockroom manager at GE back in the early days, the data was not okay. I actually posed this question to another forum I was on earlier this week, and we talked about the data. And I think the one thing that we're missing about AI is its ability to put disparate amounts of data together. So
Hmm.
we're thinking very much into the old, linear table, and these are the columns, these are the rows, and the data's got to be perfect. You can't have this,
Right.
that, and that. I do think AI will help with some of that. But I want to go back to a concept earlier you talked about, and you know, we talk about AI as artificial intelligence, but we don't talk about authentic intelligence. And so that's another concept I think is not talked about enough. And that what a lot of these systems and things should do is help free up that authentic intelligence for people so that people can be more creative. They can actually look at the inputs. I mean, imagine how much you talk about the demand planners, and the demand planners, it's a tough job because they're combing through all this data and they're
Right.
trying to figure
Right.
this out and taking what I like to call Excel hell and
Yeah.
making
Yeah.
it all kind of work together. You're right, it is a tough job. But on the flip side, I think what the automation immediately does is it helps us at least get some of that work off the table. But then we as leaders have to think, how do we help our teams be more authentically intelligent and give them the bandwidth and the democratization of decisions, and enable them to work with the insights. And that's what we need people doing. I can't sit at my desk and come up with every insight about everything in the supply chain. There's no way. So how do I, put my team in a position that they can do that? And that's some of the things I'm excited about. I mean, it's interesting to see, robots calling each other, but to me, it's about, how do you free up and untrap that capacity for people so that they can be authentic leaders.
That's a great term. I've never used that, but I'm going to steal that if that's okay.
Please.
The my application you mentioned there, I see it all the time, which is when I do a lot of work with sales and operations planning, and
Hmm.
when we're implementing it, kind of see a level, a maturity curve, right? So the first
Hmm.
few cycles, a client's going through it, right? They're just trying to get a plan put together and be able to balance the demand with the supply, and then
Hmm.
figure out where there's imbalances and what am I going to do about it, right? And then you see the maturation into scenario planning where,
Hmm.
okay, I can do my typical balancing good enough. Now I'm like, what happens if we lose this customer? What happens if, tariffs go up, right? What if? And that's where I think you're saying, can I free up a planner to actually spend more time thinking about the what if, right? And how I can scenario plan versus just putting together the plan. And so,
Yes.
to me, that's the most important revelation. And when I see clients and they get through that first like what if set of scenarios, and that
Hmm.
clicks, then all of a sudden the executives are like, this is fantastic. Like
Hmm.
this is what I've really wanted, right? I've got a tough decision, and before it would take me a long time kind of wrestle through it and try to figure out what I should do here or what I should do there. And now I've got this tool where I can say, well, what if I move this demand over to this other plant? Or what if, we get this customer? What is it going to mean for us? Are we going to need to put on another shift? How do we do that? Can we just do it with overtime? I mean, simple questions that in my mind unlock huge value in clients, and yet planners can't get to that because they're too busy
Right.
doing the stuff that hopefully will be automated, right?
Right. They just don't have the right tools in their tool set yet. But
Right.
likewise, if you think about it, a planner today, you typically hire people that are very analytical.
Mm.
They can get into the data, they can do all those
Right.
things.
Right.
But planners in the future, our responsibility as leaders has to be to upskill them to be able to tell those stories, right?
Right.
Because
Right.
their value isn't going to necessarily be in pulling the data. Their value is going to be in telling us the story, coming up with the scenarios. You know, you,
Right.
when you talk about a scenario plan, it reminded me of an ERP implementation I did years ago. And, that was, we were going to do that in SAP and all these things could happen. But even then, they were very linear thoughts. They were very linear
Absolutely.
about, you know, capacity decreases by this, demand goes up by this. When you think about it in terms of what we're embarking upon today with technology,
Right.
kind of the sky's the limit. So it's that's why I like the term authentic intelligence because
Yeah.
it is also, we have to consider humans are only designed to do so much. We can
Right.
only take in so much data at a time. So how are you able to clarify that and, get to the more specific points and priorities to make those decisions? I think those are the skills we're going to have to help people learn over the next decade.
Fantastic. So we're getting close to the end of our time here, and
No problem.
can you provide the listeners, and your future self, right, a couple predictions about the future, right? What do you think? Can be anything, pop culture, economic, whatever. Give us a couple predictions, right, so we can, kind of see how you do.
Okay. So one prediction I have is I think our next president of the United States will be a millennial. I think we will hire a millennial before we hire a Gen Xer. Um, yeah, and I've read a couple
I like
articles
that. It's a
about
hot
this,
take.
and yeah, no, no, no.
Yeah.
I've read a
Yeah.
couple
I like it.
articles about this, and
Yeah.
not
Okay.
about the presidents, but about leadership in corporations and how corporations are, more connected with millennials than they are Gen Xers. And so it got me thinking about, our politics, and I really don't care what side of the aisle you're on. But at the end of the day, I could see more candidacy coming from our millennials than Gen Xers for sure. So that's one prediction
That's
I
fair.
have.
Okay. I like it. That's
Um,
a hot take. I like it. I do. I do.
I, I think a second prediction I have. Hmm. Well, you talked about autonomous driving before.
Yeah.
I do think there'll be more autonomous driving, but I really think where we're going to see the benefits is in over-the-road trucking.
Yes. I
I'm
do.
I'm
Totally
still
agree.
not convinced it can do in city driving.
Yeah.
I've taken a Waymo before in San
Yeah.
Francisco, so it was an experience. Um,
Yeah.
but at the end of the day, I could see, when I think about, talk about stealing ideas from different regions, you look
Yeah.
at how European trucking companies work versus American trucking companies, and
Right.
American trucking is becoming more like European. And I could see trucks automated going from terminal to terminal and then
Yes.
switching out loads and stuff like that.
If Elon Musk called you tomorrow to design the first fully autonomous supply chain for Mars colony,
Okay.
what do you think the hardest part would be to get right? Right? The technology, the trust of the technology, or tacos?
Um, I think the hardest thing to get right in that would be the trust in the technology.
Right.
Um, and the reason I answer it that way is that I think right now our job needs to be is to find symbiotic relationships between, humans and technology. And if I were to put it on Mars, there's not many humans, and so that's why I would answer the question that way. But if Elon Musk called me, I think my first thing would be is to probably be like faint and be like, "Why are you calling me?" And then kind of go from there. But yeah, that's an interesting question. I almost wanted to come back on the podcast so I can do a redo on that one. I got to
Let's
think of that
reboot
one a
that.
little bit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
let's reboot that for sure. I like it. I like it. We'll start with that next time.
Yes.
Well, Chris, man, it's been great to spend this time with you. Love all the topics we covered, and really appreciate all the insight. You're just an incredibly intelligent supply chain guy, and I love having you on. So we'll have to do it again.
Yeah, for sure, Hank. Look forward to meeting with you again. Thank you.